For the first time in Family Feud history, Steve Harvey's famous voice fell completely silent in the studio. Not because of technical difficulties, not because he forgot his lines, but because standing in front of him was a family who had never heard a single word he'd ever said. A family who'd watched his show for years, but had never heard his laugh, his jokes, or his voice, until today when one 8-year-old boy heard Steve Harvey for the very first time, and his reaction stopped 300 people cold. It was November 7th, 2019, at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta, Georgia. Steve was filming his second episode of the day and everything seemed routine. The audience was energetic, the contestants were ready, and Steve was doing what he does best, making people laugh before the cameras even started rolling. But when the Williams family walked onto the stage, something felt different. David and Sarah Williams stood at the podium with their 3 children and Sarah's mother, Eleanor. At first glance, they looked like any other Family Feud family, smiling, excited, dressed in matching blue shirts with their family name printed on them. But as they positioned themselves at their spots, something became clear to everyone watching. The family wasn't responding to the warm-up comedians' jokes. They were watching each other, communicating with quick hand movements, their eyes locked on each other in a way that seemed almost choreographed. Then a woman stepped forward from the side of the stage, a sign language interpreter. The studio audience went quiet as they realized what they were witnessing. This entire family was deaf. David Williams, age 42, had been born without hearing. His wife Sarah, age 39, had lost her hearing to meningitis when she was 5 years old. Their 3 children, twins Emma and Ethan, age 12, and their youngest Marcus, age 8, had all been born deaf as well. Sarah's mother, Eleanor, age 67, had been deaf since birth. For the Williams family, silence wasn't just their world. It was their language, their bond, their way of life. But there was something about Marcus that made this story different. Something that would change everything. Marcus Williams had spent every day of his 8 years in complete silence. He'd never heard his mother sing, never heard his father's laugh, never heard the sound of his own voice. 2 weeks before the Family Feud taping, Marcus underwent surgery for cochlear implants, sophisticated devices that could give him the ability to hear for the first time in his life. The surgery was risky, expensive, and came with no guarantees. The Williams family had saved for 3 years to afford it. They'd held fundraisers, worked extra shifts, and accepted help from their community. Not because Marcus needed to hear to be complete. His parents made that very clear. Marcus was perfect exactly as he was, but they wanted to give him a choice. The choice to experience sound if he wanted it. The choice to exist in both the hearing world and the deaf world. On October 24, 2019, doctors activated Marcus's cochlear implants for the first time. The family gathered in the audiologist's office, all of them signing encouragement to Marcus, who sat nervously in the chair. When the doctor flipped the switch, Marcus's eyes went wide. His hands flew to the devices on his ears. His mouth opened in shock. He could hear. The first sound Marcus ever processed wasn't music or his mother's voice. It was the ambient noise of the medical office, the hum of fluorescent lights, the quiet buzz of computers, the rustling of papers. But that evening, when the family returned home, Marcus heard something else. His father turned on the television, and there, filling their living room, was the sound of Steve Harvey laughing on Family Feud. Marcus turned toward the TV, mesmerized. He'd watched this show dozens of times with his family, following along through captions and his family signing. But now, for the first time, he could hear the man whose face he knew so well. Steve Harvey's distinctive laugh, loud, genuine, infectious, became the first human voice Marcus truly heard and understood. "That's Steve Harvey," his mother signed to him, tears streaming down her face. "That's the man we watch every night." Marcus stared at the screen, his small hands touching his ears in wonder. He'd found his first voice, and it belonged to Steve Harvey. The Williams family had applied to be on Family Feud 8 months before Marcus's surgery. It was a family tradition. Every night at dinner they'd watch the show together, competing to see who could guess the answers first, laughing at Steve's reactions, even though they couldn't hear his jokes. When they received the acceptance email for the show, the family was overjoyed. Marcus, who was 6 months away from his surgery at that time, signed to his parents, "I want to hear Steve for real." His parents had no idea if the surgery would happen in time, no idea if it would even work. But here they were, 2 weeks after Marcus's activation, standing on the Family Feud stage, and Marcus was about to hear Steve Harvey in person. Steve Harvey walked to his podium, his signature smile in place, ready to do his usual family introduction. The interpreter stood nearby, ready to translate. "All right, we got the Williams family," Steve announced to the audience's applause. But he immediately noticed something was different about how the family responded. They were watching the interpreter, not him. Steve's smile softened as understanding crossed his face. He looked at David Williams and started to speak, but then paused. For a man whose entire career was built on his voice, on his timing, on his verbal comedy, this was completely new territory. The interpreter signed Steve's greeting. David signed back, and the interpreter spoke. "We're so honored to be here, Steve. Our family has watched you for years. You're part of our dinner table every single night." Steve put his hand over his heart, visibly moved. "That means the world to me," he said, waiting for the interpretation before continuing. "Tell me about your beautiful family." David introduced his wife, his mother-in-law, and his twins. Then he gestured to Marcus, the youngest, who was staring at Steve with an intensity that seemed unusual, even given the circumstances. "And this is Marcus," the interpreter translated as David signed. "He's 8 years old, and Steve, he has something he wants to tell you." Steve bent down slightly, giving Marcus his full attention. "What's up, little man?" he asked gently. Marcus looked at his father, who nodded encouragement. Then Marcus did something that shocked everyone, including his family. He spoke out loud. "You were my first voice." The words were halting, unsure, the speech of someone still learning how sounds worked. But they were clear enough for Steve to understand. Steve froze. His famous smile disappeared. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The interpreter signed to the family, and David quickly signed back, his own eyes filling with tears. The interpreter spoke. "Marcus was born deaf. 2 weeks ago he received cochlear implants. When they activated them and we went home, we turned on the TV. You were on. Your laugh, your voice." That was the very first thing Marcus heard. The first voice he ever recognized as human speech. You were his first. Steve Harvey stood completely still for a long moment. The studio audience was silent. Even the crew had stopped moving. Then Steve did something he'd never done in 17 years of hosting Family Feud. He walked away from his podium, stepped around the game board, and approached Marcus. He knelt down in front of the 8-year-old boy, his eyes level with Marcus's. "Marcus," Steve said softly, speaking directly to him. "Can you hear me right now?" Marcus nodded, his eyes wide and sparkling. "You can really hear me?" Marcus nodded again, and a smile spread across his face. Steve reached out and gently placed his hand on Marcus's shoulder. "I have spent my entire life talking," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've told jokes, hosted shows, given speeches. I've used my voice for 40 years. He paused, struggling to compose himself. "But nobody has ever told me I was their first voice. That might be the greatest honor anyone has ever given me." Steve pulled Marcus into a gentle hug, and the studio erupted in applause. But Steve wasn't done. Steve stood up, still holding Marcus's hand, and turned to the producers off camera. "We need to stop," Steve said firmly. "I need a moment with this family." The director's voice came through. "Steve, we're on a schedule." "I don't care about the schedule," Steve interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "This is more important." He looked at the Williams family, all of them watching him with tears in their eyes. "I want to understand," Steve said, speaking slowly so Marcus could read his lips while hearing him. "Tell me what this means. Tell me what Marcus went through." For the next 15 minutes, while cameras stopped rolling and the audience sat in reverent silence, Sarah Williams told their story. Through the interpreter, she explained Marcus's surgery, the years of saving, the moment of activation, and how Steve's voice had become the anchor for Marcus's new world of sound. Every night since his activation, Sarah signed, "Marcus makes us turn on Family Feud. He listens to you speak. He's learning speech patterns by mimicking your voice. You're teaching him how to talk, Steve. You're teaching my son how to use his voice." Steve Harvey, the man known for always having a comeback, for never being at a loss for words, stood speechless. Tears rolled down his face openly. "I need to do something," Steve finally said. He turned to his producers. "Get the Steve Harvey Foundation on the phone right now." When cameras started rolling again, Steve Harvey addressed the audience with a seriousness they'd never seen from him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, I've been hosting Family Feud for 17 years. I've met thousands of families. I've given away millions of dollars in prizes. I've had funny moments, awkward moments, shocking moments. He looked at the Williams family. But I have never experienced anything like this. This family came here today and they've taught me something profound about what my voice means, about what all of our voices mean. He turned to Marcus specifically. Marcus, buddy, I'm making you a promise right now. The Steve Harvey Foundation is going to make sure every kid who needs cochlear implants but can't afford them gets a chance. We're going to create a fund in your name. The Marcus Williams Hearing Fund. The audience erupted in applause, but Steve held up his hand. And Marcus, I want you to know something else. You said I was your first voice. Well, you've given me something too. You've reminded me why I have this voice in the first place. It's not just to make people laugh. It's to connect with people, to matter to people, to be there for people. Steve wiped his eyes. Let's play this game. And Marcus, I'm going to make sure you hear every single word I say today. The Williams family played Family Feud that day like no family had played before. Steve adjusted his entire hosting style. He spoke more slowly, enunciated more clearly, and constantly checked in with Marcus to make sure he was following along. When Marcus correctly guessed an answer, shouting pizza in his halting but growing voice, Steve dropped his cards and gave him a standing ovation. When the family won $20,000 in fast money, Steve insisted that Marcus be the one to hit the final buzzer, guiding the boy's hand to the button. Marcus, Steve said, kneeling beside him as the winning lights flashed. Do you hear how loud this audience is? Cheering? They're cheering for you, buddy. For you and your amazing family. Marcus listened, his face full of wonder, experiencing applause for the first time in his life. The episode aired 3 weeks later and became the most watched Family Feud episode in the show's history. The clip went viral, gathering over 300 million views across all platforms. But more importantly, the Marcus Williams Hearing Fund received over $5 million in donations in its first month. To date, it has provided cochlear implants for over 200 children who couldn't otherwise afford them. Marcus Williams is now 13 years old. He's fluent in both sign language and spoken English. He's become a spokesperson for the deaf community, talking about how cochlear implants gave him access to sound, while his deaf identity gave him access to a rich, beautiful culture. And he still watches Family Feud every single night, still listens to Steve Harvey's voice, still remembers that moment when the first human voice he ever heard belonged to the man who would change his life forever. Steve Harvey gave me more than sound, Marcus said in a recent interview, his speech now clear and confident. He gave me proof that my voice matters too, that I have something to say, that I belong in both worlds. Steve Harvey keeps a photo in his dressing room. It's a picture from that November day in 2019. Steve kneeling in front of 8-year-old Marcus, both of them smiling, Marcus's small hand touching his cochlear implant in wonder. Underneath the photo, Steve wrote, "My first voice, the greatest honor of my career." Because sometimes the most important thing we'll ever do with our voices isn't the jokes we tell or the shows we host. It's being the first sound in someone's new world. It's being the voice that says, you matter, you're heard, you belong.